He rubbed his dick, soft. It never got hard anymore. Spent and hung up constructing ways to get the capsules down his mother's throat. Maybe he wouldn't need the Rohypnol at all. He knew that lots of moms were into stuff with their kids. He'd seen it in streams and threads and chatted with some of them, and they'd shown him parts of their bodies, and he'd shown them his, and they'd whisper about feeling each other's skin if only they could share the same space, but alas, years back, before touching bodies made him nauseous, before his mind learned to engorge the bodies with germs and excrement. I haven't been reading very much for the last week and a half. Been trying and failing to get myself to read. But today I have content for you.
I'm sorry I was gone, but look, I made you some content. Daddy made you your favorite, open wide. Here comes the content.
We have a review of Amygdalatropolis by B.R. Yeager. Those who follow the channel know that I just read and reviewed recently, not even 2 weeks ago, Yeager's follow-up to this book, Negative Space. I was very excited to read his other book, and so I did, and I did it as a buddy read with Juan from Plagued by Visions, who will be releasing a review of it as well. I will be linking that below, and maybe even there, if I can figure out how to do that. This book, according to an interview that I read with Yeager, was inspired by his time spent on places like 8chan, and how he wanted to make something worthwhile out of the time and energy that he invested into spending time in those places, which is a somewhat tiring and bleak use of your time. I know because I have spent time there. Not on 8chan, which didn't exist back when I was spending time in those parts of the internet, but 4chan, for sure. This was in the mid-2000s, like 2006, 2007, probably, was when I spent a good amount of time there. And that's what this book is about. It's about a board. It functions exactly like a Chan board, but it's called 1404er. And every user is referred to as the same. So our protagonist, our narrator, is also referred to as 1404er in the narration. We're presented with a number of sort of interweaving narratives. We have just a sort of normal, traditional narrative that is describing 1404er's life as a extremely reclusive, agoraphobic young man. At the beginning of the book, he's in his teens. It's not totally clear how old he is. Late teens. And he does not leave his room. He won't leave his room. And he does have interactions with his mother, who talks to him through the door. But that's the only in-person interaction that he has in his life. He works remote and makes enough money to afford his Kung Pao noodle boxes, and he lives in the master bedroom of the house, so he doesn't have to go out to use the bathroom. So he's set. He's just in the room forever. Then we have actual posts on the board, which range in all sorts of topics, as you would expect, having spent time on those places. There's parts where they talk about how to kill people. There's parts where they talk about exploring the dark web. There's parts where they get into a long discussion about whether or not you can drive stick shift. all sorts of metaphysical stuff, and then talking about the sort of things that you sort of, I think, especially if you haven't spent time in those places, would expect, like there's extended sequences of doxing people and harassing them for various reasons, encouraging people to do things like rape and abuse, and the glorification of like abusing children and things like that, which is absolutely something that's present in those places, no doubt. One thing that this book doesn't really look at that deeply is the sort of irony and like irony death of places like this on the internet, where you start being edgy for the sake of being edgy until you end up converting yourself and believing in your own edginess, which is a very real thing, which is how so much of the like internet radical right happened, I think. Now up front, I'll say that I liked this book a good deal, but I did not like it as much as Negative Space. One thing I am going to go over briefly that was something that I really was off-put by is that this book is like 150 pages long, but it has a 35-page introduction, sort of like how you would expect from like a Penguin classic or something. It's a well-researched, it's got 60 plus footnotes of references, critical essay that is largely about Georges Bataille, the French author and philosopher, Bataille's writings on Nietzsche, and then applying those writings to Amygdalatropolis. This introduction, when I started reading it, I thought it was going to be some sort of like metafictional something. And it's not. It's just a straightforward, extremely dense essay. It spoils parts of the book, uses lots of passages from the book in it, and ultimately doesn't really, to me, leave you with any sort of deep takeaway. It talks about like beauty in things that are ugly. Yeah. It's a weird choice to think that Yeager finished this book and was like, you know what this needs? An essay, almost like more than 20% of the length of the actual text to precede the book, is weird, and it doesn't do anything for me, and I have to kind of dock the book a bit for its presence. It's frustrating and off-putting and weird and unhelpful. The things that I really liked about this book were how authentic it felt. I felt like I could tell that Yeager had spent time in these parts of the internet because it felt authentic to that experience. My biggest problem with this book compared to Negative Space was that this one didn't feel like it had a particularly strong sort of message to it. 1404 is... it's not shied away from that he does reprehensible things. I mean, that passage that I read to open the review, he's fantasizing about being in an incestuous sexual relationship with his mother, and at one point in the book, spoilers, he drugs his mom and tries to rape her while she's unconscious. He doesn't do it, because the experience of touching human skin is so disgusting and upsetting to him that he can't bring himself to do it. And yet, the book has a very sympathetic lens for its narrator. You feel bad for him. You see how mental illness has degraded his life and left him this sort of shell person. And how the culture of places like the boards that he spends time on foster this antisocial, violent, misogynistic, awful way of living. That being said, it doesn't feel like Yeager is condemning places like this. It's an interesting balance that he casts, where maybe I'm putting myself, my own feelings onto this here, but it feels like it shows how these places are refuges for people like the narrator who have nothing and nowhere else to go. Ultimately, there's a lot to like here. If you're into experimental fiction, the structure of this will be appealing to you, the way that it bounces back and forth between the narrative and the boards, and then there are these italicized sections that are maybe dreams, or just at one point it seems like it could be like a description of a video game that the narrator is playing, or maybe a dream about a video game. It's not totally clear. And then how they all sort of interact and interweave with each other is very interesting. If you are into disturbing literature, there's plenty here for you. I mean, things are that I've already discussed or described in here, maybe not as explicitly as in some books, but I think that the frank language that is used about things like sexual assault of children will be upsetting to people. Basically what I'm saying is that it doesn't feel like there's an ultimate point to everything in the book. It doesn't feel like there's a message. It doesn't feel like I gained anything from reading it. And maybe that is because of the nihilistic nature of the main character and the nihilistic nature of the topics that are being discussed. Maybe the idea is that there is no point. But that's not satisfying narratively. You know? You want to have there be a purpose. You know? You want to learn something. You want to take something away from your experience. And so while this book was very well written, and I enjoyed reading it, I didn't really get anything out of it. I'd still urge you to read it if it sounds interesting to you, because I think it's a good book. It's just not as good as Negative Space. Negative Space was a book that felt like it had a lot to say. This feels more like an exercise in style. Man, I've been having a shitty week, and this review feels incoherent, so I apologize. Please watch Juan's review of it, which will almost certainly be better than this one, but we talked about the book for quite a while, and it was a really good experience. It was my first time doing like a buddy read with a booktuber, So that was really cool. It was very cool of him to reach out and make that happen. Yeah. 4 out of 5. It's a good book. Have you read this book? Have you read anything else by him, or have you read anything else like it? I don't think I've ever read or heard of a book that's specifically about Chan boards. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking around through all this mess. Yeah.